Need your daily fix on mixed martial arts?
We're going to kind of recap Bellator 155.
From UFC 198.
Who's who?
Kind of a controversial decision.
And who's not.
I couldn't figure out why, and then it hit me.
Well, don't you fret, because Golden State Media Concepts got you covered. Get your daily dose of MMA podcasts. Everything from the UFC, Bellator Fighting Championship, Extreme Cage Fighting, Invicta Fighting Championship, and so much more. Join us as we talk about some of the biggest names in mixed martial arts. We've got you covered here on Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC MMA Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Arnel De Leon, and hopefully you are doing perfectly fine. You are healthy, you're enjoying yourself at quarantine at home. Whether you live in the States or internationally, you are doing perfectly fine, you are healthy, and everything is going well for you during a time of uncertainty. So, hopefully you're healthy. You know what? Good news! UFC 249 has a location, finally, after nearly a month of speculation on where will UFC 249 be happening. We've got a location and more, and it's very surprising what's happening here, as it is reported by Bloody Elbow. I'm getting this news source from the bloodyelbow.com. Reported that UFC 249 will take place at Tachi Palace Casino in California. Me being a person who lives in California, this comes to a shocker to me completely, considering that just like New York, California is going through a shutdown, and also it is increasingly getting very frightening living in California, knowing that the rates of the death and the cases that are happening in other coronavirus is more prevalent in California than any other state in America right now. So I thought California would be the absolute last place that an event would go and take place. It really astounds me, but apparently it's happening in California. The UFC has finally found a location for their upcoming pay-per-view after weeks of searching, according to the New York Times, as the Tachi Palace Casino in California will host UFC 249 on April 18. UFC 249 was originally scheduled to take place at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. However, due to the outbreak of the coronavirus putting a halt into sporting events around the globe, the New York State Athletic Commission would not recognize the event, and the UFC were forced to find a new venue. The Tachi Palace Casino Resort, home to the defunct Tachi Palace fights and several WEC shows, is located in Lemoore, California, and site on land owned by the Tachi Yoko tribe, who are part of a federally recognized Santa Rosa Indian community. This means they are exempt from guidelines against holding large gatherings during COVID-19 and do not have to be sanctioned by the California State Athletic Commission. Interestingly enough, though, the casino has been temporarily closed since March 20th. As a response to the pandemic, the UFC intends to run the next 4 cards at this venue, with a private island expected to be secured for international fighters who cannot travel to the U.S. A press release from the CSAC released on Monday reading the following. The Commission echoes the guidance of California Governor Gavin Newsom, the Department of Public Health, local health officials, and the recommendations of the Association of Ringside Physicians regarding the cancellation of events where people may be at risk of contracting COVID-19, and encourages the industry to do the same. The California Athletic Commission said in a statement, the Commission will not participate in the UFC event on April 18th, regardless of the event location. The last-minute location change is just one of many problems the UFC 249 has encountered the last week. A handful of matchups were scrapped as fighters were forced off the card due to travel restrictions, including UFC lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was scheduled to fight Tony Ferguson in the main event. Instead, top contender Justin Gaethje will now fight Ferguson for the interim lightweight title. So, a lot to unpack there, but practically the California Athletic Commission will not oversee this event. Instead, there's going to be a loophole around it where they are going to participate in the event in California under a tribe that due to some rule bending here, the UFC could legally have an event to happen in California without the need of the California Athletic Commission to watch over them, and it's perfectly fine and legal. So that's the weird loophole that UFC is doing. And also, another interesting note here is that there will be an island, which is the biggest head scratcher there is. So, the island here, it's unknown where this island is, but the speculation is that Dana White rented an island. They rented an island, and they're going to build their own facility, just like they did for another UFC show. I think they did for another UFC show, where they built a building primarily just to hold that one MMA event, and then they're going to tear it down. The same exact thing applies for the UFC shows coming up in the island. So it is said here that the casino in California will host the next 4 cards, but we don't know what's going to happen with the island. We don't know what's going to happen with the island for sure. In a recent interview that ESPN MMA had with Dana White cleared up some of the confusion over this, and he says the island will be primarily for international fighters, which means we are not going to see, it's expected that we are not going to see any international fighters fight against U.S. fighters. The interview from ESPN MMA asked Dana White, hey, will this island be just international fighters or will there be American fighters fighting against international fighters? And so far, from what I'm getting this, Dana White said, it will just be for international fighters so far. That's the idea so far. We intend to hopefully have U.S. fighters come in and fight in this island. We don't know where this island is, but we're going to have U.S. fighters fight international fighters in this island as a plan or idea for a future event, but we don't know when this COVID-19 issue will go down. So right now, that's tossed up in the air. So if we have 2 international fighters, if we have a U.S. fighter versus an international fighter, that fight will probably be scrapped, probably. So we got like Jose Aldo and Henry Cejudo. Jose Aldo tends to go to Brazil and train there. So if Jose Aldo were to make the travel, he would probably not be able to make it due to limitations of international travel. So if I'm Dana White, from his perspective, we can speculate that we're not going to see Jose Aldo versus Henry Cejudo, probably. He will try to aim for the island fight, will be Henry Cejudo versus Jose Aldo in the island. But I can guarantee you right now that based on how the UFC is shaping their events, we won't see any international fighters or fighters who train internationally or go internationally and then come back to America. If you are an international fighter, then you better stay in America if you want to fight in all the American cards. That's how it is. If you are an international fighter and you do not train in the Americas, then you are going to fight all the other international fighters, which the good thing about the UFC now is that there are a bunch of international fighters right now in the UFC representing different parts of the world. So you might see someone like an Israel Adesanya who might go fight in the island. So there's also an interview that happened with El Helwani and Israel Adesanya. So Helwani and all these other fighters are doing interviews on what their opinion is on the fact that U.S. fighters will fight in California that are fighting outside the California Athletic State Commission's like Overwatch and then the island. And Israel Adesanya was joking that, you know what? If I were to fight in the United States, it would be probably from the Illuminati because it is so ridiculous at this point that the fighters are pretty much left in the dark and only Dana White is the one who's like giving out, only Dana White so far is the only one with information. The fighters don't know any information and it kind of is a good thing really. I understand Dana White's like increasingly large tension he has with the fighters. Like even Israel Adesanya says, yeah, there's a lot of fighters that don't like Dana White's, and it's because Israel Adesanya, despite being a champion, Khabib Nurmagomedov, despite being a champion, Daniel Cormier, despite him being a former double champion, Henry Cejudo, who was a double champion just recently, but he lost it and now is only a singles champion, he doesn't know. All the champions, despite having a whole lot of clout with them within the UFC, do not know what's happening within the UFC, and so far only Dana White knows it, so I understand why, considering the fact that a lot of MMA fighters, Adesanya said it, that like you're not supposed to take any of the fighters seriously when it comes to like their opinions on the actual organization themselves. You don't have to take it all that seriously. It's just them like prepping themselves up. And considering that if you go on YouTube all the time and you put up UFC or mixed martial arts, you always see Chael Sonnen, and he's always providing an opinion on. He's always providing an opinion, or he's providing theories, or like conspiracy theories, or ideas or concepts that don't relate to him at all, that never pan out as they actually do. and he starts throwing like promos in the middle of his videos, you can't really take his words seriously. And Adesanya says you're not supposed to take any of the fighters seriously when they are throwing their names out there for UFC 249. So all in all, we can expect 4 UFC events happening in California, while we can expect an X number of events happening for international fighters. But do not expect international fighters and US fighters to compete in the same soil for a while, because even Dana White says, hey, that's kind of a reach. We're going to aim for that, but so far that's not in the plans. It's not in the early plans. So international fighters, undisclosed island. US fighters, just in California.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts. Past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
So where does this leave current UFC lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov? And well, Khabib Nurmagomedov, when Dana White did an interview for ESPN MMA, he said Khabib Nurmagomedov didn't fly back to Russia. He was flown there, and that left some questions puzzling on what was to be expected of Khabib in the future. And when the ESPN MMA interviewer asked Dana White, hey, why will this lightweight title bout between Justin Gaethje and Tony Ferguson be for the interim title, considering the fact that Khabib Nurmagomedov is still open to fights, apparently. So, Khabib Nurmagomedov is the current UFC lightweight champion, according to Justin Gaethje and Dana White. Tony Ferguson took the news of him not fighting Khabib Nurmagomedov pretty well for himself, actually. I think at this point, people were pretty much doubting a Khabib versus Tony Ferguson fight because the interviewer asked Dana White, hey, this is the 5th time this fight has been canceled. And when he asked Dana White last year if he was going to make a Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson fight again, Dana White says, no, it was not going to happen at all, throwing out some expletives, throwing out some swear words, saying it's never going to flip and happen. And then he does make the fight happen, and then it gets canceled yet again. So can we expect Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov at some point in the future? And the answer is yes, it does. It makes sense to me. Even though this fight has been coined as being cursed, as being sick, as being tainted, like it's the worst luck ever, that this fight, after 5 occasions, cannot happen. And if this fight if Dana White were to announce, hey, it's going to be Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson again for the 6th time, a lot of people would be doubting it and be like, yeah, sure, what's going to happen this time? And I think this fight between Khabib and Ferguson still has legs. Now, it doesn't. Now, if Justin Gaethje were to defeat Tony Ferguson and Gaethje were to somehow defeat Khabib Nurmagomedov, there is still money in Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, even though there's a lot of doubt. That is a big money fight. They are 2 of the best lightweights out in the entire UFC right now. It's hard to imagine those 2 not fight at some point. And there had to be constant, like, random obstacles being thrown into this card for this event to not happen. And so when Dana White was asked, hey, will this fight between Khabib and Ferguson happen despite all the obstacles that are constantly being thrown away for the past couple of years? Dana White says, you know what? Yes, it can happen because this fight at this point has to happen. Ferguson and Khabib are title contenders, so at some point these 2 have to fight in some way or another. And considering the fact that Conor McGregor is chipping his way in for a title fight, we could see Conor McGregor fight a Khabib or fight a Ferguson or fight Justin Gaethje. The 4 fighters of Conor McGregor, Tony Ferguson, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and Justin Gaethje, all those 4 fighters can interchange and fight each other multiple times over the course of the next 2.5 years, and it would make sense. It'd be money fights. It'd be money fights between any combination of any of those 2 fighters out of the 4. So I can expect this fight being rebooked again for the 6th time, and hopefully for the 6th time it's gonna happen. So this is coming in from Yahoo Sports. Dana White absolves Khabib Nurmagomedov as saying Khabib didn't fly back to Russia, he got flown back to Russia. UFC President Dana White has been hit from all angles as they tried to keep UFC 240 main event between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson intact. In the end of the day, though, it was rescheduled and it became Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson for the interim lightweight title. Khabib ended up getting flown back to Russia. He didn't fly back to Russia. He got flown back to Russia. That's weird. So that's his quote there. He didn't fly back to Russia. He got flown back to Russia. Nurmagomedov did not pass blame to anybody but the COVID-19 pandemic that is running rampant, forcing ever-tightening restrictions across the globe. This is coming in from Khabib himself. Number one thing that make me crazy when people say I pull out or I do something, I don't understand this. I still training since December. I trained very hard. December 9, I come to US because UFC give me location. New York Barclays Center. I come US. I train 40 days. Then everything is go crazy. Nurmagomedov told ESPN. They say US a 100% no fights. No, okay. So if we're gonna take Khabib's word here that someone told him USA 100% no fights, you kind of have to pass blame to the person who told Khabib that. Then he said, okay, we moved to Abu Dhabi. Dubai? Why? Because they told me 99% it's gonna be in Dubai. Like last my training camp, how I did, I came to US, I trained with Coach Javier in AKA 55 days. When we moved to Abu Dhabi, because this fight was gonna happen in Abu Dhabi, I understand if Abu Dhabi, no problem, we did this before, we're gonna do this one more time, we come, they close gate, but this is not my problem, I don't make mistake one more time, I wanna say I am Khabib, I am not coronavirus. When Nurmagomedov arrived to Abu Dhabi, he found the country closed to foreigners and was sent home to Russia. After announcing the revamped UFC 249 card, White conducted a lengthy interview with ESPN's Brett Okamoto, defending his lightweight champion. I know everybody was going crazy on Khabib. Khabib didn't do anything wrong. You look at the way the world changed. Literally, by the day he got caught up, he ended up getting flown back to Russia. He didn't fly back to Russia, he got flown back to Russia. It sucks. What are you going to do? White was as disappointed as anyone that Khabib vs. Ferguson was next for the 5th time, but left fortunate to navigate the most difficult thing he's ever had to do and end up in another stellar main event. I could go for 10 minutes telling you that whole thing fell apart. The reality is that is nobody's fault. Every day when I got up, the rules changed. Things were shutting down, things were closing. Dana White said, Khabib got caught up in Russia. It was a total mishap. We all made mistakes in that one. Nobody is to blame for that. If it is what it is, the fact that we can even pull off an event right now, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. By far the hardest thing I've ever done. But if you look at Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, ridiculous fight, and a fight that absolutely makes sense. Khabib vs. Tony should be happening, but it should have happened 5 times ago. I'm starting to believe Joe Rogan that this fight is cursed. That this is an incredible main event, and I have a lot of respect for both guys standing up. So we heard it in from Dana White's. It just happens. It is probably to blame from both parties. I didn't think Khabib should have immediately traveled to Abu Dhabi without 100% confirmation that it was going to happen in Abu Dhabi. Somebody should have stopped him. His manager should have stopped him. Dana was like, hey, it could be in Abu Dhabi, but I'm still unsure. And consider the fact that they told him it's 100% not going to happen. This is the interesting part. He told Khabib that it's 100%, not Dana White, but some representative of the UFC, told Khabib that it wasn't going to happen in the US 100%. Then less than a week later, it is announced that UFC 249 will happen in the US, but not just the US, the most populated state and all of the states in the US. So I can sort of understand Khabib Nurmagomedov being a little bit frustrated about this situation here. And it's not hard for Dana White, being a person who has a tendency of blaming people and calling out people for being an idiot or being stupid. And even though he acts kind of irrational, and in many occasions Dana White does come across as very irrational, I think he understands that his representatives, the UFC representatives, made a mishap. He said himself that it was partly everyone's fault. It was Khabib's fault for being too headstrong to travel to Abu Dhabi. it was the UFC representative's fault for telling Khabib that it was not going to happen in the US without giving 100% confirmation that is true. So it's a little bit of everyone's fault. Now, I'm not sure if Khabib Nurmagomedov will be paid for this hypothetical fight that didn't even happen in the first place. He was going to fight Tony Ferguson, and now that he was not going to fight Tony Ferguson, will he be paid? I'm not really sure. Dana White says that the UFC fighters who got kicked off the card will be paid. Now, we're not sure if they'll be paid 100% guaranteed, because right now, currently, athletes from other sporting events are not being paid of their entire paycheck because they're not participating in their sporting events. So, will Khabib Nurmagomedov be fully paid? I'm not sure. I think he should be paid because, considering the fact that it's partly the UFC's fault and a little bit of his fault on this miscommunication that's happening, he could have, if someone told him, Khabib, just stay in the US, just stay here until we know until we know what's happening. But that didn't happen, and because of that, it is probably to blame Khabib, but he should be a little bit compensated considering the fact that he was given false information. But, plus ups for Justin Gaethje here, a guy who wasn't even planned to be in this event is going to be making six figures. I guarantee you he's going to be making probably $500,000, six figures, maybe even an extra bonus considering the fact that this is an impromptu fight that Justin Gaethje did not prep up for. So, Gaethje, he's going to be making a lot of money through this, and he's going to be in the good graces of Dana White, which helps out a lot in the long term for the next 2-3 years. So, we'll be coming back here with some more MMA news. You're listening to the GSMC MMA podcast, coming back right after the break.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
So now that we know that Dana White and the UFC are securing a private island for MMA fighters, for international MMA fighters to compete in, and it's all secretive and no one knows where this island even is going to be at, people are comparing this to the Fyre Festival. If you don't know, the Fyre Festival is this party that's going to happen in this like extravagant island that nobody has ever heard of. It was going to be this extravagant, larger than life, great party scene. And then when the people actually came to the Fyre Festival Island, it was awful. People were given horrible food. They were given these horrible tents. It was promoted that this island was this amazing thing. And they actually went there and happened to be a complete disaster. If you haven't heard anything about the Fyre Festival, then I recommend you go Google it, YouTube it. You're going to laugh your butt off with it. And there are a lot of people comparing the UFC events happening in the island with the Fyre Festival because it's so shrouded in mystery that nobody knows even till now, people don't know the true, the true background information and the concept of what Fyre Festival was supposed to be and what actually happened and why there's a lot of scheming involved in the Fyre Festival. And the same thing kind of applies for Dana White and the private island because we don't know what to expect from this island. For all we know, there could be tribes people who live in that island, and Dana White's like, hey man, it's a secured private island, and fighters come in here, you guys are gonna compete, you guys are gonna participate, and you can ignore the tribal people outside with spears, okay? No one knows what to expect from the secure island, and I'm getting Fyre Festival vibes. There are fighters and people in the media who are comparing this to Fyre Festival, and hopefully it doesn't become a complete mess where people are eating horrible sandwiches in an undisclosed location under ugly white tents. So it is reported from ESPN MMA, Ariel Helwani did an interview with Anthony Smith and is headlined as UFC's Anthony Smith fights home intruder, man charged with criminal trespass. A man has been charged after unlawfully entering the Nebraska home of UFC fighter Anthony Smith early Sunday morning, according to the police. Luke Herberman was arrested and charged with first-degree criminal trespass and misdemeanor, according to Sergeant Wayne Hudson. Smith said in an interview with ESPN's Ariel Helwani on Monday that he woke up just after 4 a.m. local time Sunday to a stranger in his Omaka area home. The UFC light heavyweight said he tried to subdue Haberman for more than 5 minutes while waiting for the police to arrive. Haberman did not steal anything, Smith said, and it was unclear why he was in the house. Smith and his family, he lives with his wife, mother-in-law, and 3 daughters. No one was injured, thankfully. Smith described the incident as terrifying and called it one of the toughest fights he has ever had. Smith said his wife woke him up and told him that there was a man in the house. Smith said he could hear a man's voice screaming at the top of his lungs. Smith left the bedroom, turned a corner, and saw Haberman in his computer room. Alright then. I don't know what he's trying to do in the computer room, but I don't know, stealing some stuff, hacking the computer, I don't know. Smith said Haberman walked toward him, and it seemed as if he was trying to scare him. Smith was concerned the man had a weapon. Smith said he tried to take him down, and the two began fighting. I didn't know what he had, Smith said. Typically, people don't break into your house in the middle of the night for any good reasons. I'm expecting that I'm gonna hear a gunshot, or he's gonna stab me, like he's got something. I figured I've got about 2 minutes before whatever he has takes me out. Smith said his goal was to protect his family, his wife, and his children, and took them to the bedroom and closed the door. Smith fights at 205. Somehow, he said, this man who weighed around 170 was still coming at him, an elite UFC fighter, for minutes. No normal human being is able to fight like that, Smith said. I am by no means the baddest dude on the planet, but he's a regular Joe, and I had a hard time dealing with him. And he took everything I gave him. Every punch, every knee, every elbow. He took every single one of them and kept fighting me. At one point, Smith said, his mother-in-law brought him a kitchen knife, which he held to Haberman, who continued to fight him. Oh my gosh. According to Smith, Haberman told him, hey man, I'm sorry, as he walked by after things calmed down. Hudson said Haberman was issued a citation and released to the hospital. He was not taken to police custody, but must report to court later in the date. Smith said he experienced a wide range of emotions afterward, including anger and then fear that someone had targeted him. He no longer thinks that's the case, but there is confusion about what the man wanted. Smith said his neighbors had video of Haberman trying to enter their home, and he succeeded in entering another home before being scared away. Haberman entered Smith's home through an open garage door. I'm not lying when I said it was one of the toughest fights I've ever had in my whole life. I went into the fight ready to die. Nobody smart breaks into a house in the middle of the night, unarmed, when they break at night. It's to hurt people. So he goes on to say how scary and how frightening the event is to him. And I find this where is he living, man? Because if it turns out that Smith's house happens to be the 3rd house or the 4th house that this man has dropped in, then this guy must have been looking for something. I don't think it was a hit more than anything else. I don't think someone sent this random man to go and attack a UFC fighter, especially if he had no weapons or no items in it. From my guess, it was a man with mental health issues who was just randomly breaking into people's houses. And then Smith's house just so happened to be the 3rd one. And in the 2 other houses that he broke in, once again, it might not be 2. It could be just 1 house. It could be 4 houses. It could be 3 houses. Whatever. It is noted that this man broke into multiple people's houses right before he reached to Anthony Smith's house. So, from my idea is that he broke into other people's house, had some mental health issues. He was going over, I've interacted with homeless people and people who's gone through schizophrenia and other mental health issues. I have fought people with mental health issues, literally, and you can go fight these people or you can go interact with these people, and they'll just not remember or not know what exactly is happening. I told the story of this one time when somebody stole my clothes. There was a period of time when I was homeless, and someone stole my clothes and someone stole my stuff. And when the police came in and they arrested the man absolutely you can tell when someone's lying or not. You can, especially if it's somebody who's being pinned down by the police, there's absolutely zero reason why you would lie at all. Especially if you're a homeless person, there's zero reason for you to lie. And so this man, he was pinned down, and he still had no clue what was happening. The police officer was there interrogating him, asking him questions out in the open. And this man didn't even know the person was a police officer. He had to keep asking them, hey, are you the police? Are you the police? Are you the police? Every 30 seconds to a minute. And that's what happens when you have people with mental health issues, and the fact that they don't know exactly what they're supposed to do. Here's my theory, my idea here is that this man broke into Anthony Smith's house. He found a computer, he found a laptop, and he probably was just he was just playing with it. I don't think he was trying to break in, trying to find some bank accounts. I don't think he was trying to go there to go find some like information they can use to blackmail Anthony Smith. I just think he was randomly just wandering and droning about in around the area. He was randomly droning in about going inside people's houses, and when he saw Anthony Smith's computer, he was like, "Hey, a computer, go in there, start messing with it." So I used to, in the most recent election, I worked in the election team. And in the election team, we had to travel around different locations in order to go get ballots and votes and then return them to the warehouse across Southern California. So as we were traveling to these different locations, there are homeless people everywhere. There are a lot of homeless people, and there are even like people who you think were normal looking people who would come right at me and start yelling out the most random things ever. And just pretty much like, they're just like incapable of recognizing what's happening in the world. Like that's why in California especially, if you're just driving down the streets and there's a green light that's happening, don't be surprised if you see a homeless man who just sleeping in the middle of the streets or walking when they really shouldn't be walking and when there's a green light happening. It just happens in California. Anthony Smith lives in Nebraska. I'm not really sure about the Nebraska area, but from my personal experiences handling with the homeless people and handling with people with mental health issues, this is a scenario where I can imagine a person with mental health issues going through random houses and doing whatever they think is going on in their own head. That's my speculation. And a good thing Anthony Smith is a professional fighter, because in most cases, and also it's a good thing that this man didn't have a weapon, because even if you were a professional fighter, this scenario is very scary. Like, even if you had if you had peak Fedor Emelianenko or peak Chuck Liddell, and someone brought a knife or a gun, it's very likely that no matter how trained or experienced the person is in fighting, that's a huge handicap that can go against you. And good thing nobody really got hurt. So Anthony Smith is all fine. He protected his family, and I'm happy, and I'm pretty sure the neighborhood is thankful that he was able to put away this man who could potentially hurt everyone else in the neighborhood. So I'll be back here with some more MMA news. You're listening to the GSMC MMA podcast, coming back right after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
This is coming in from MMA News that Dana White says Joe Rogan will be at UFC 249. So it was discussed in the GRE podcast that Joe Rogan says that, you know what, the Khabib versus Ferguson fight, that fight is canceled, and because of the whole pandemonium that's happening in California, he says he's not going to go call the fight. He's not going to call the event for UFC 249. And if you've been following the GRE podcast that's been happening, you would know that Joe Rogan is constantly talking about the COVID-19 coronavirus issue that's happening in the Los Angeles area, in the California area where he lives. And he takes it very, very seriously on this issue. And he's always speculating on what's next. How's the economy handling COVID-19? How is California? How's Los Angeles handling this issue? He really doubted UFC 249 from even happening in the first place. He says, you know what? It might happen. It might not happen. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't even happen in the first place. So it is reported by MMA News that Dana White says Joe Rogan will be at UFC 249. So despite saying he wouldn't be commentating at UFC 249, Joe Rogan will apparently be in the booth with Dana White. It is said to be believed. UFC 249 appears to finally have a location, albeit undisclosed. Not only that, but White says the UFC is securing a private island for future events, and those events would involve international fighters. It's not sure whether or not those fights will have U.S. fighters and international fighters. And so far, the idea is U.S. fighters will primarily fight in California, while international fighters will primarily fight in this island. And Dana White is thinking, possibly in the future, depending on where COVID-19 is or where the status of COVID-19 is in America. Then he's going to change up the card and see if he can make U.S. fighters fight international fighters. But Dana White says Joe Rogan will appear at UFC 249. During the interview with TMZ Sports, White responded to Rogan claiming he'd be out of UFC 249 and found some way to blame the media once again. He did not say that, Dana White said to TMZ. Again, you cannot listen to anything the media says. Nobody talked to him. They heard him talking on a podcast, so they start writing stories off a podcast, and you know what? They are full of it. Rogan will be there. Rogan did in fact say he would not be commentating in UFC 249 on his podcast, and there's a transcript that literally had him saying the words, he would not go commentate for UFC 249. The UFC is talking about putting on a fight on April 18th, Rogan said. I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that in the United States. They're talking about doing it in a place with less than 10 people, just an open arena. I guess someone's going to commentate it because it's not going to be me. And they're going to be duking it out in an empty place, and they're going to try to do that on the 18th. UFC 249 new main event will feature interim lightweight title bout between Justin Gaethje and Tony Ferguson. So this is another instance of Dana White pretty much ranting on about the media, saying you can't trust the media, you can't believe what they're saying. They heard something from the podcast. My idea is, which is very ironic considering the fact that, like, from what I'm guessing here, that he probably heard about Joe Rogan saying that he's not going to do the commentary on the podcast, but instead of actually looking at the actual podcast and listening to Joe Rogan, it's there. I think it's like a 2-minute clip. Just go on YouTube, put up Joe Rogan, UFC 249, and you literally hear him say the words that he doesn't think he's going to commentate for UFC 249. My guess was that Dana White, he found this source through an alternative way. Like, he was going through like USA News, Yahoo News, Washington Post, and then there's a post that said, Joe Rogan says he's not going to participate at UFC 249. So instead of Dana White saying, do not believe anything you hear in the news. But he got his main source about Joe Rogan, not from Joe Rogan himself, not even from his podcast, but from an alternative news source. And then he blames media for coming up with that, even though it's actually very rational, and it came from Joe Rogan's mouth. So I just find it very intriguing that Dana White's like, don't believe in the news. And then he's like, don't believe the news that they said Joe Rogan says he's not going to participate in UFC 249, even though he probably didn't even hear the podcast. I don't think has Dana White ever been in the JRE podcast? I don't really think so. I know, those two have interacted a lot. And I think Rogan has done many interviews with Dana White, but I'm unsure if Dana White listens consistently of the JRE podcast, which I wouldn't be surprised. He's got a bunch of stuff he's working on. He's a really busy man, Dana White is. And you know, I respect the dude who can go and make an event happen when everyone else in the world doesn't think that sports can still be a thing, even though COVID-19 is being a huge issue in the States. So I respect Dana White for having the passion to go and put out UFC 249, even though all the doubters made it very, very difficult for anybody who'd be in his position to keep the show going. Like, I really believe that UFC 249 would be canceled and would be moved back a week or two. But Dana White, he did it somehow, but he just can't keep slamming the media when the media has accurate sources, especially when the sources comes from the person directly, like Rogan. So, Joe Rogan, will he be at UFC 249? My guess is Rogan will be like, you know what? I guess so, apparently. Because I wouldn't think I'd be able to do it, but apparently I am. So, and also Rogan is in California. He lives in the LA area. He's just a couple hours away. I'm a couple hours away from the actual location where they're going to do the UFC event. So if I can do it, I'm pretty sure Rogan can do it. No doubt about that. And other news, this is coming in from BJPen.com, that Tyron Woodley says Colby Covington turned down fight against him at UFC 249. So it is reported here that former UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley says that Colby Covington turned down a fight in UFC 249. There is no love lost between the two, and it is put here that Woodley says that this is the fifth time Covington has declined the fight. Says he dropped the ball again last night. We have yet to get a confirmation from Colby Covington's side, but according to a source here, Tyron Woodley says that Colby Covington is ducking him, and this really isn't anything new. If you've been following Tyron Woodley and Colby Covington, they've been beefing and been talking smack to each other via Twitter and on Instagram for the longest of time. And also considering that, like, Tyron Woodley works with TMZ Sports, so he's within the media spectrum, and his mind is in other places other than mixed martial arts. Like, he wants to be an actor, like he's kind of like part actor, part musician, part reporter at the same time. So his mind is in other aspects of the entertainment industry, and as a person, and like I can guess that if he works in the entertainment industry, and also especially working at TMZ, and the fact that UFC mixed martial arts is very tied with WWE, and there are a lot of fighters in the world of mixed martial arts who grew up as WWE pro wrestling fans, and then upon being a fan, they transitioned themselves into being mixed martial artists. I wouldn't be surprised if Tyron Woodley is in that same boat here, considering the fact that he involves himself in media. And then you have a guy like Colby Covington, who actually has participated in pro wrestling matches in Impact Wrestling. He didn't really do much, even though he's right now pretty much a real life, like, not real life, even though he's presenting himself as a WWE style pro wrestling character. If you actually followed Colby Covington's work in pro wrestling, he wasn't really more than a side character for the most part. So the storyline was King Mo. I think it was American Top Team. So it was King Mo and Dan Lambert along with Bobby Lashley versus Stephen Bonner. That's how it is. So it was Stephen Bonner and Moose, former linebacker, I think, for the Atlanta Falcons. So those two were teamed up, and they were facing against King Mo, Dan Lambert, Bobby Lashley, and the rest of American Top Team, which also included Colby Covington. And Colby Covington, if you wanted to see something really funny, go type up like Impact Wrestling, Bobby Lashley, Dan Lambert, and it's the entirety of like American Top Team pretty much cutting pro wrestling promos in front of a character in a very cringy way. And you see them making entrances. By the way, Dan Lambert, man, the dude's a complete mark for pro wrestling. If like, go put up Impact Wrestling, put up Dan Lambert, and then you're going to see a bunch of videos of how much of a mark Dan Lambert is for like Memphis Wrestling, AWA, NWA classic, like 70s, 80s pro wrestling. He's talking about like World Warrior, Animal, and Hawk. Dan Lambert's and American Top Team, like pro wrestling marks, who even involved himself in Impact Wrestling, which in the world of pro wrestling is a third-rate wrestling company. So if you ever hear Colby Covington say anything, you're not supposed to take it seriously. Is he ducking a fight with Tyron Woodley? I'm not really sure. I say you don't have to accept every fight. Can we just accept that? If someone challenges you and you recognize that it isn't really feasible for you to go fight that person, whether it be like you have issues with the scheduling or the contenderships, or you want to bypass a certain fighter because you believe you want to go fight for the title right away. If Colby Covington genuinely believes he can go skip over Tyron Woodley and go for a title fight, and he is capable of negotiating that, then he doesn't have to agree to a fight with Tyron Woodley. It's not just Fighter A wants to fight Fighter B and Fighter B has to accept a fight against Fighter A. That's not how it really works. So coming up right after the break, we will discuss some more MMA news right here, the GSMC MMA podcast, coming up right after the break.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
So today marks a very special day for one very specific fighter, and that is Matt Serra, because this is the 13-year anniversary to which Matt Serra defeated George St. Pierre with a TKO and became a champion. One of the biggest underdog fights in the history of mixed martial arts. So in April 7, 2007, Matt Serra defeated GSP at UFC 69. In 2006, GSP won the UFC's welterweight title after a TKO victory over Matt Hughes. The win against the only man to have ever beaten him solidified St. Pierre's promise as one of the most exciting and talented fighters to have ever graced the sport ever. So even back in 2007, GSP was considered top 3 best fighters in the entire world. Right now, in hindsight, we now know that GSP is maybe the greatest fighter ever in UFC history. Maybe. He's in contention of being top 5, top 10. So he received his title shot after a 5-fight winning streak, defeating against guys like Dave Strasser, Jason Miller, Frank Trigg, Sean Turk, and BJ Penn. With the pedigree of fighters on that list of UFC gold around his waist, there was no doubting that George St. Pierre was the obvious best fighter in the entire welterweight division, and be very difficult to see someone unseat him. With George St. Pierre defeating everybody in the welterweight division, the UFC went to the Ultimate Fighter to find the next contender. The UFC set up one of the more memorable iterations of the Ultimate Fighter with Tough 4, The Comeback. The season included 2 tournaments, one for the welterweight and one for the middleweight, and it promised a title shot for the winner of each bracket. The middleweight winner, which was Travis Lutter, got to face off against Anderson Silva. That didn't turn out well for him, while the welterweight winner got a crack at GSP. Can you imagine that? After you go through this gruesome tournament where you're fighting against a bunch of fighters who you do not know that much, but are very tough, they are fighting for their life, trying to fight for their families, trying to support their families and friends, and then you go up against Anderson Silva or George St. Pierre. That is a high mountain. Talk about a huge disparity of skill level. You've got these fighters here who some of them don't even fight full time. Some of them are just part-time fighters and they do something else. Like Stipe Miocic is also a firefighter. You got some fighters who own restaurants and are mixed martial artists. You got some fighters who do real estate and are also mixed martial artists. You got some fighters who are simply just waiters or waitresses, and then they also do MMA fighting on the side. So in the early seasons of the Ultimate Fighter, where a lot of these fighters are not even fighters full time in the world of mixed martial arts, they're just fighting either as a hobby or they're fighting as an alternate career path to what they're already doing. I find it very bizarre when you have fighters like Michael Bisping, Forrest Griffin, and like Nate Diaz. Like after going through the Ultimate Fighter, they had to go through a very long and difficult road ahead of them after the Ultimate Fighter to go get themselves a title shot or to finally become champion. For this season, for the Ultimate Fighter Season 4, yeah, you immediately get a title shot. You immediately get a main event match against probably the best fighter in the entire organization. That is a huge, huge mountain to climb. And one fighter who successfully did that was Matt Serra, who was the man who came out on top of the competition at 170 pounds. Before Tough, he had a decent UFC tenure with wins over, Yves Edwards, Jeff Couron, and Ivan Majevar. On the reality show, Matt Serra subbed in Pete Spratt, got revenge against Shory Carter, and then beat Chris Lytle in the finals. Now, I'm not disrespecting Chris Lytle at all, but once again, Chris Lytle versus GSP and Anderson Silva, an enormous mountain to climb, as UFC 69 at Houston's Toyota Center was chosen as a spot where he would try to convert his Tough plaque into a UFC belt. Matt Serra versus GSP lasted under 4 minutes and ended with an amazing TKO victory for the Long Islander. For this era of MMA, the result was about the most shocking thing that could have ever happened. The super athlete GSP has been humbled, and the crafty veteran Matt Serra has shocked the world, putting himself atop one of MMA's most elite divisions. If this happened today, GSP would get his rematch 6 months later, but things were different in 2007. Though, 4 months after being stunned by Serra, Matt Serra out-wrestled Josh Koscheck. And if you guys don't remember, Josh Koscheck was one of the biggest heels in mixed martial arts at the time. Like, his proxy nowadays would be Colby Covington. A really good wrestler, a very underrated boxer. He doesn't have that much power game for the most part, but he was known for his cockiness and acting like a complete jerk all the time. Josh Koscheck was cutting pro wrestling heel promos before Chael Sonnen did it. And Koscheck was one of the most hated people ever in all of UFC at the time. That's why, in his fight against Paul Daly, he fought against Paul Daly and he got into Paul Daly's head so much that pretty much Paul Daly got himself kicked out from the UFC because he threw a punch right after a round was over. And Koscheck was really smart in the mind games here. And if you look at the Matt Serra versus George St. Pierre fight, St. Pierre came to the fight with the wrong strategy for the most part. So, the obvious strategy GSP would go for when fighting against Matt Serra would be to use his range and distance. If you see the height and the arm reach advantage that GSP had over Matt Serra, and with the way how Matt Serra fights like a traditional boxer with his elbows tucked in, him fighting in a very closed in stance, very closed. GSP being a lot more freeform in his stance and how he moves. It should have been GSP's fight to win, considering the fact that how dynamic of a fighter GSP was. And for the first 2 minutes of the fight, GSP was fighting all the shots. He was fighting all the right angles. But GSP became a little bit too cocky, and he started to go for dirty boxing against Matt Serra. And in that scenario, GSP would lose because Matt Serra fighting a very closed-in boxing stance here. The only way Matt Serra would go and defeat GSP is if GSP got inside the pocket of Matt Serra, because Matt Serra has some really great punching power, and he's a really good technical boxer, really. The only issue that he had with GSP was the fact that GSP had so much length on Serra that GSP could go in, he had throw in some jabs, throw in some right hooks, and then come out. GSP was fighting very smart and very safe for the first 2 minutes, and then it felt like GSP got a little bit too cocky. He tried to go in for some dirty boxing, tried to close in a distance, tried to go for the knockout victory. He went from fighting outside the pocket to inside Matt Serra's pocket, which didn't help him out in the end, as he got TKO'd. So, when St. Pierre fought against Josh Koscheck, which went 5 rounds, GSP fought a lot more smarter in the fight against Koscheck. Koscheck was completely out of his league. GSP fought very patient. He fought very careful because Josh Koscheck was really, really good wrestler. And by the way, in GSP's fight against Matt Serra, GSP didn't attempt a single takedown at all. Or if he did, he kind of sprawled just a wee bit. Like, GSP really wasn't trying to go for the wrestling. He was trying to go for the knockout victory against Serra. And GSP got a little bit impatient and he dived in there. And he got himself in a position that ended up with him getting knocked out, which is the exact opposite that happened in the GSP versus Koscheck fight, to which St. Pierre was very safe. I remember that time, a lot of people were saying Koscheck versus St. Pierre was a really boring fight because people expected a lot out of St. Pierre's boxing game. Like, he to try to compensate for his loss of him getting knocked out against Matt Serra. People speculated that St. Pierre would try to knock out Josh Koscheck. And in this scenario, St. Pierre just out-wrestled against Josh Koscheck, fought very smart, fought very safe, and then he would go fight against Matt Serra for the second time, and he would win that fight. So St. Pierre learned his lesson in fighting Matt Serra and fighting against Josh Koscheck, and through that he became a better fighter. But what happened to Matt Serra afterwards? So after pulling off the stunning victory, because in what goes down as one of the most biggest underdog fights in the history of the UFC, and I don't think there's going to be another underdog fight like that that's going to come anywhere soon. The closest thing I'm thinking about was when Renan Barão fought against TJ Dillashaw. If you guys don't remember, TJ Dillashaw was a complete underdog. He participated in the Ultimate Fighter. He fought Barão. Barão was considered the next future world champion in the bantamweight division to go fight against Dominic Cruz. And things didn't turn out well for Renan Barão as TJ Dillashaw defeated him. And then from that point on, Barão has been kind of going back up and down through the rankings while TJ Dillashaw ended up becoming a champion. So that's the closest underdog fight I can think of right now of recent memory. But after Matt Serra defeated GSP, he held the belt for a year. The first fight between GSP and Matt Serra took place April 7, 2007. And then the second fight took place April 19, 2008. So there was going to be an initial rematch immediately after the Koscheck fight that GSP had, but because of an injury, Matt Serra had to pull out, and so GSP was interim champion for a while. And then it became GSP versus Matt Serra 1 year later, to which GSP got his win back. After that point, though, Matt Serra lost against Matt Hughes, Frank Trigg, and then Chris Lytle got his win back from the Ultimate Fighter against Matt Serra in the UFC 119 show that took place on my birthday, September 25, 2010. So that's the career of Matt Serra. He had one really good high, and that high led him to a championship victory, which to this day, people still talk about it, and Matt Serra still talks about the day he defeated GSP for the welterweight belt. One of the most biggest moments ever in all of mixed martial arts. So coming up right after the break here, I want to go challenge your brain power and your knowledge of mixed martial arts and the UFC coming up right after the break.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
So you think you know mixed martial arts? You think you know more about the UFC than your average Daily Joe? Well, let's test it out here as I got a quiz here from Quizzing to test out your knowledge of the world of mixed martial arts here. I'll ask you a series of questions and hopefully you do well with me. I'm going to take the quiz and you guys can take the quiz with me and we'll see how well you do versus me. So do we have any UFC fans in the house ready to set their to test their expertise on the sports? First question, who is the youngest champion in UFC history? Is it A, Tito Ortiz, B, Jose Aldo, or C, John Jones? The obvious answer here is John Jones. John Jones is the youngest ever UFC champion in history. He won the belt in his early 20s. It was either 22 or 24, but he was a young prospect at the time. And I really thought he was going to be champion like 3 years later than he actually did. Ended up winning it. He won it at such a young... I thought Mauricio Shogun Rua would destroy John Jones. Off the base of the idea of John Jones for the longest time was John Jones has the potential. He has the potential. John Jones has all the tools. He has all the potential to become a future world champion. And when you're to compare John Jones, who's this guy who's like, this guy's the future, versus someone like Mauricio Shogun Rua, who at the time was considered the best light heavyweight, the best light heavyweight ever. And I would call him one of my personal favorite light heavyweight champions of all time. Shogun Rua has a long pedigree of dominance. And when you compare his long historical pedigree versus John Jones, it was very unlikely that John Jones would go defeat Shogun. I think Jones came into the fight as the underdog in the championship bout, and then Jones defeated Shogun Rua and became the light heavyweight champion. It was a surprise victory for me at the time. But now, looking at it with hindsight, Jones definitely did have all the tools, and instead of him just being a guy with a lot of potential, he became the guy for the light heavyweight division. So, who has the most UFC pay-per-view event main event wins? Who has the most UFC pay-per-view main event wins? Alright then, so we got here option A, Anderson Silva, B, Randy Couture, or C, George St. Pierre. Who has the most UFC main event pay-per-view victories? I'd have to go with Randy Couture. I'm going with Randy Couture off the base that he's been there, he's participated in more UFC events, and which means he's more likely to get booked into being in the main event of these fights. So I pick Randy Couture. And I got it, Randy Couture. Randy Couture is the correct answer. Part of me thought it would be Anderson Silva or GSP, but those two interchanged in main event spots in the late 2000s era, to which there were a lot of... The belts were constantly being hot potatoed around during the late 2000s, and so it was hard for anyone to be consistent. Guys like GSP and Anderson Silva, they were consistent in that they were able to maintain their belts for a long period of time, but they weren't consistently main eventing, if that made any sense. They were doing a great job defending their belts, but they weren't main eventing all the time. You had guys like Brock Lesnar who were main eventing in the UFC, even though like he had 2 fights in grand total in his resume. But a fighter like Brock Lesnar would take precedence over Silva and GSP when it comes to main eventing pay-per-views. Where is the UFC headquarters located? It is located in A, New York, B, Las Vegas, or C, in London. Dang, can you imagine French Dana White? Yeah, it's in Las Vegas. UFC is in Las Vegas. I remember that because Dana White, if you follow him, is constantly talking about how his family is stuck in quarantine purgatory, and Dana White's getting increasingly bored in his own place. So, who has scored the fastest KO in UFC history in 2019? Is it A, Conor McGregor, B, Dustin Poirier, or C, Jorge Masvidal? The answer for this one is an obvious C, with Jorge Masvidal knocking out Ben Askren with a flying knee. I've seen that fight because it's like a 10-second fight or 11 seconds. So I keep seeing that clip over and over again, and it's almost impossible to not watch that happen and not kind of smile or giggle a wee bit, because Ben Askren was talking so much smack that to the point that he kind of became a heel. Ben Askren was getting in that territory of Chael Sonnen and the fact that he was a heel guy, and you didn't dislike him because he was a heel. You disliked him for the fact that he was playing a character. And so when you had a guy like Jorge Masvidal come in, he sees this guy doing these WWE style promos, hyping himself up immensely, playing a character, and you see Jorge Masvidal knock him out at such ease, and to the point now, if you like follow like Ben Askren interviews, Ben Askren talks a game to everybody. Like, he still goes into character mode and talks about how he can go and defeat everybody. Ben Askren will be like, I can defeat Tyron Woodley. I can go defeat Daniel Cormier. I can defeat John Jones. I can defeat Amanda Nunes. So Ben Askren's still talking smack to everyone except Jorge Masvidal, which I find so intriguing because the guy was constantly talking smack about Jorge Masvidal in their lead up. Who is the first ever UFC heavyweight champion ever? Was it Dan Severn, Randy Couture, or Mark Coleman? Dan Severn, I think, was the first super fight champion. Dan Severn was the first ever super fight champion, while Randy Couture he became a champion later on. He became a champion after Dan Severn became a champion, so who did Severn... So is the era of Severn, Mark Coleman, and Shamrock. I would say Mark Coleman was the first ever UFC heavyweight champion, which then led to I forgot how the scenario went, but like Coleman, Severn, and Shamrock were like switching titles that they revolted around like a heavyweight title and then the super fight title. And Randy Couture won his belt later on. And I remember it took a while for Severn. The UFC was around for a while until Severn became the super fight champion. So Mark Coleman was the answer. He is the first ever UFC heavyweight champion. Whose nickname is the Prodigy? Is it BJ Penn, Darren Till, or Carlos Condit? While Darren Till may be considered a prodigy right now, it ain't him. The nickname belongs to BJ Penn, which is the correct answer. Who is the first fighter to defeat Chuck Liddell in the UFC? Was it A, Tito Ortiz, B, Rashad Evans, or C, Jeremy Horn? The answer is Jeremy Horn. If you guys don't remember early UFC, to which when Chuck Liddell wasn't at his very best, Jeremy Horn, along with Dan Severn, are those fighters. If you look at their win-loss record, you gotta be like, wow, they're one of the best ever. Like, they're the greatest, probably the greatest fighters ever. Because Dan Severn and Jeremy Horn, I think Dan Severn is at I think both of them are over 100 wins. But both of them have pretty much 100 wins in their entire UFC career. Like 100 wins, less than 20 losses. And you look at Jeremy Horn's record, but you look at the respect that people have for Jeremy Horn, it's not all that even, really. Jeremy Horn defeated a young Chuck Liddell when Chuck Liddell was still developing. Jeremy Horn, to the hardcore mixed martial arts fans, is considered one of the best ever. But if you talk about strictly just primarily on Jeremy Horn's UFC career, it's not all that impressive. Even when he defeated Chuck Liddell, Jeremy Horn was the favorite in that fight. Liddell didn't reach that certain capacity yet. Tito Ortiz and Rashad Evans. By the time Chuck Liddell fought against Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell had to go and lose against Jeremy Horn to better develop himself as a fighter, and Rashad Evans came in a much later time in Liddell's career. So Jeremy Horn, if you guys don't remember, is an amazing fighter outside of the UFC. And in early UFC, you might say Jeremy Horn was an absolute beast, and you'd be unlucky to face against Jeremy Horn in the early era of UFC. Liddell got his win back against Jeremy Horn, to which Liddell absolutely smoked him in the rematch, a one-sided fight. And it's very interesting to see, if you want to see how far Liddell has gone in his career, compare Liddell's first fight against Jeremy Horn and then the second fight against Jeremy Horn, and you will see how much Chuck Liddell has improved from being just a beginning fighter to probably the best fighter in the UFC at the time when he fought Jeremy Horn the second time too. So, what year was the UFC founded? 1993, 1997, or 2001? The answer is 1993, because by 1997, I remember WWE was trying to cash in on Ken Shamrock's popularity from the UFC. So if Ken Shamrock debuted in the WWE in 1997, he fought in the UFC for several years and made a name for himself, which would be in 1993. Demetrius Johnson defended the flyweight title how many times? Is it 7 times, 11 times, or 13 times? I remember it is 11 because Demetrius Johnson brags about it whenever he can. And then which MMA women's fighter nicknamed themselves as the Boogie Woman? The answer here is Joanna Jędrzejczyk. It's weird, they call Ronda Rousey the Boogie Woman in the WWE, and Amanda Nunes is kind of taking the claim as the Boogie Woman, but that's not their official nickname. It's Joanna Jędrzejczyk. So Joanna Jędrzejczyk is the Boogie Woman and also is known as the Queen of the Strawweight Women's Division. So thank you for listening to the GSMC MMA podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and on Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.